Have you ever wondered what your dreams mean? Join us in Dream School at thisjungianlife.com and find out. Jung wrote, "Dreams are a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul."
Dream School is a unique, self-paced online program you can start at any time that unlocks access to your inner world. Our 12-month program provides the support, knowledge, and guidance you need to reach within, decipher your personal dream code, and harness it to optimize your life. By enrolling, you'll join an affirming community of fellow travelers, each pursuing a unique quest.
And it's fun. Join us on an adventure to wholeness and healing through understanding your dreams. Go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Dream School. You'll be taken to our secure checkout. Once you join, you'll get immediate access to our first 3 modules. You can get started right away. We look forward to seeing you there.
Welcome to This Jungian Life. 3 good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Today we're going to explore a deep and often avoided topic, the unspoken phallic wounding of men. In a deep analysis, eventually every man I work with has to confront the taboos that block them from facing their own sexual wounds. This is ultimately archetypal. It surfaces in myths and fairy tales like the Fisher King, whose groin wound would not heal until he was asked the right question. The murdered Osiris, whose phallus was cut off by his brother and thrown into the ocean. Chiron, the god of healing, who was rejected by his parents and shot in the thigh with an arrow. And Beauty and the Beast, where the young prince is cursed and deformed. So, across time and cultures, these themes repeat again and again, and they're pointing to something that we cannot avoid. We'll also bring a cultural lens from time to time to explore how men are suffering in this current massive cultural churning that is powerfully challenging many patriarchal structures and assumptions. The first thing I'd like to propose is that the core archetype of men, and we're talking about biological men and not the category of masculinity, is Phallos, which is the ancient primordial image of the erection. This is something we can easily track across ancient religions. In India, the Shiva Lingam stones are harvested from the rivers. They're draped in flowers, they're offered ghee, and they're thought to be the procreative phallus of the godhead. The ancient Celts depicted the horned god Cernunnos with an erection. The Romans and the Greeks paid homage to Phallos as a sacred, autonomous, inseminating, dynamic, assertive, curious force. And Hermes' erection marked crossroads across the Roman Empire. These anatomically correct columns of carved stones were called herms, and they dotted the landscape of the ancient world. And people actually instinctively still create these without even knowing about Hermes, like when you go to a public park and you'll see these carefully stacked columns of river stones scattered about. I think that that's a resonance of this ancient impulse. And even now, God the Father is central in modern Christianity as the creative matrix of the world. I think we can appreciate the concept of the fertile phallus, but the challenge is to understand how that is alive, actually alive, in the psyches of men we are encountering in our practices now. They are facing challenges and assaults to that essential dynamic reality at the foundation of what it is for them to be a man. And I think that this is a tremendous, important piece of work that is not being appreciated. Another idea I'd like to put on the table for discussion is the shifting dynamic in the patriarchal social and cultural system. How the patriarchy has afforded men certain opportunities, but has also inhibited and wounded them. And one definition of patriarchy, which may seem overly simplistic, but for our conversation I think is valid in its dark effect. Patriarchy is a strategic intelligence that is designed to obscure male vulnerability. And male vulnerability is sometimes confused with femininity, which I think is a great mistake and prevents men from exploring this fully in themselves. So men are vulnerable in ways that are different from the way women experience themselves as vulnerable. And there's something to be differentiated there which feels essential.
There are many ways, I think, that men are wounded by our culture. I think I always have trouble with the term patriarchy because I think about it a little bit differently. But it's absolutely true that there's this cultural wounding where men are expected to bury their feelings, to be tough, to not be sensitive, to not be interested in certain things, to kind of present with a kind of machismo. I mean, even I see this even in my practice with young men now. So I think we think that the culture has changed somewhat and that this isn't as true, but I think it's really pretty persistent that men are expected to not have much feeling and are expected to be gruff and aggressive, for example. So anything that doesn't fit that, men, boys are encouraged to tuck away. So that is definitely an aspect of male wounding.
I am absolutely blown away by all that we have already opened up. And what I'm reflecting on is kind of what is patriarchy? Is it an archetype? And where I go with that is to the good king, the archetype of the king, good and bad, because as you said, Lisa, there's a dark and a light side to every archetype. And that we know about from all kinds of mythology, all kinds of fairy tales of, the tales where the king is ailing or the king saves the day. And I'm kind of going with that for how it might appear historically and in men today. Of on the one hand, man up, don't be a wuss, don't cry, don't complain, get going. But on the other hand, what you alluded to, Joseph, with the archetype of Phallos as being fertile and creative and inseminating, there's an aliveness in it. And I wonder what young men do with that today. Is two pretty different sets of expectations that have archetypal taproots in the light and dark sides of Phallos, masculinity, kingship.
Right. And I want to just embroider on what you just said for a minute, Deb, because I think, on the one hand, men are told that they should be aggressive, let's say. And on the other hand, they're often shamed for their aggressiveness. And so I think that men in our culture get this tremendous double bind, that they're both expected to sort of be the strong man, and women will like that. And at the same time, when they enact that, there are these messages about toxic masculinity and how is one supposed to thread that needle. And going back to an archetypal perspective that we're trying to invoke here, this idea as Phallos, as an archetype. The thing about an archetype is that it has a certain autonomy. It's not under ego control. nor is the unconscious, nor for that matter, are anyone's sexual yearnings or strivings. I mean, women's or a man's. I mean, you don't decide who you get attracted to. You don't decide when you get an erection. It happens outside of ego control, and it is a powerful image, therefore, of the autonomy of this archetypal force that can get constellated in a man's life and move him out into the world.
And I think if we imagine in ancient cultures, before we had any sense of science and biology, the appearance of the erection was miraculous. Mm-hmm. That something seemed to inhabit a part of the body and change a man's psyche and ideally excite his partner into this engagement, both to increase arousal and then to release it orgasmically. But in the ancient world, intercourse was not associated even with fertility. That in some ancient cultures, the spirits of the ancestors would somehow inhabit a woman's womb and command a kind of birth, and that the drive to copulate seemed like some other kind of magic. As civilizations continued, and as, of course, there was a recognition that the husbandry of animals could produce different results, that moved into consciousness. But even once intercourse and the creation of children was linked together, what causes the penis to become erect was still a great mystery. And I have to tell you right now, because a lot of men suffer from erectile dysfunction, it is still a mystery that the science about what causes an erection and an orgasm in a man is not well known. It's some very mysterious coordination of the brain, the neurologic system, particularly the central nervous system that comes out of the lower back, a lower lumbar area. It's all kind of neuropeptides zooming around, and all kinds of interference is possible in what's a fairly delicate system. So we're still in this mystery of why does this happen and how does it happen?
It seems to me too, I mean, I think I'm picking up on that in an intuitive way. It may not be clear what the follow-on is, but that this is the archetype that sort of stands behind the life of every man, and that he has to somehow confront and come to terms with and figure out how to integrate this kind of, not just the biology of the physical erection, the psychological correlate to it, the mythological and symbolic correlate to it, of being moved autonomously in this mysterious way by something that, is effectively transpersonal. And how does the ego relate to that? And I'm thinking of Jung's first dream.
Right.
His first dream when he was 3 or 4. And the dream starts off with him being in a meadow, and he sees a dark stone-lined hole in the ground, and he goes down into the earth, and he finds there a chamber with an arched ceiling. And in the center, there's a low platform, and on the platform, there's a rich golden throne. And he said it's a magnificent throne, a real king's throne in a fairy tale. Something was standing on it, which I thought at first was a tree trunk, 12 to 15 feet high and about 1.5 to 2 feet thick. It was a huge thing reaching almost to the ceiling, but it was of a curious composition. It was made of skin and naked flesh, and on top there was something like a rounded head with no face and no hair. On the very top of the head was a single eye gazing motionlessly upward. The thing did not move, and yet I had the feeling that it might at any moment crawl off the throne like a worm and creep toward me. I was paralyzed with terror. At that moment, I heard from outside and above me my mother's voice. She called out, "Yes, just look at him. That is the maneater." That intensified my terror still more, and I woke sweating and scared to death. And my imagination about this kind of visitation by this phallus that he had as a young child, is that it was a first confrontation with his destiny, that he was going to be asked to inhabit his phallic potential. And we know that a lot of Jung's life story was coming to terms with his complicated relationship with his father, and that this is something that all men have to negotiate somehow.
So there's something here that touches me in a new way about this dream of Jung's that he had when he was so young, and was so filled with such a vivid image and such intensely felt affect of the ambivalence around Phallos, of on the one hand expected to be a man, he's a little boy, and his destiny will be ahead of him, although of course he couldn't consciously know what that would be. The juxtaposition of this throne underground, a king's throne, and then this awful sort of worm-like thing, and the critical condemnatory voice of his mother.
Yes.
It's the perfect depiction, really, of the double bind that we've been talking about. You want to be a king? You want to have a big destiny? You want this thing coming toward you? Maybe we're all ambivalent about a lot of archetypal things. Today it happens to be the Phallos, but that this is our task of individuation is how do we reconcile these opposites?
That's great.
If we were to consider that as an opposite, I'm wondering what the polarity is. I mean, are we talking about the child versus the man? I mean, is that the opposition? We're talking about the vagina in a polarity to the penis. I mean, what are we imagining the polarity is?
I'm imagining that the polarity is the kingliness and the golden throne, and then this outsized, kind of worm-like thing that he sees on the throne, which is clearly a phallus, but is his phallic energy kingly, divine, and golden, or is it
dangerous?
Yes,
It's
out of
the
proportion
maneater.
and ugly, worm-like.
And I think that that's the polarity that's so important to our conversation, because in most Western cultures, that the penis is considered a very ambivalent organ. Young boys are taught at a very young age to hide, to not touch, and to be somewhat embarrassed. And I understand that that's part of socializing us so that we're not walking around naked. But there's a real sense of shame around the genitals and the hiding. It's very rare for me to find a man that feels proud of his erection, that feels that there is a kind of inspirited flesh that is part of his body. And I find in my work with men, as we move into sexual wounding, there are a great many stories of feeling humiliated by having an erection at a time that was mysterious, either explicitly humiliated by other men, by family members, feeling that their own exploration of their body was incredibly transgressive. Sometimes we're raised in homes where we're taught that masturbation is a sin, the sin of Onan, and that God, in that biblical story, God might kill you for ejaculating. There's also a sense that, the penis gets people in trouble. In Yiddish, the euphemism for penis is schmendrick, which means little devil. So there's a sense that the desire, the intensity of arousal, and the seeking for sexual connection is somehow devilish, which sets up a polarity between being the good boy, who does not have phallic energy, who's obedient to the mother, and is the nice boy, versus being phallically driven. And I would say we can't really separate the phallus from the body. I don't think we can take that energy and just spiritualize it and only look at it as a symbolic process, that it is both, because it is something that marks a man from birth that I don't think can just be spiritualized.
So I feel like we're in this particular realm, and I want to bring in this important book about male psychology called Iron John. It's an old book at this point, but just a beautiful book. I think it relates in a way to this polarity that we're talking about and that you were just elaborating, Joseph. And I think it also relates to Jung's dream. The book deals with this gorgeous Grimm's fairy tale called Iron John. And in it, a little boy has to steal the key to free the wild man. And the key is under his mother's pillow. So it's the mother, in essence, psychologically, not necessarily talking about the personal mother and what she does, although it might be true. But it is the mother who sort of shames and civilizes the little boy and his urges. And to become a man, he needs to steal the key from her. He needs to claim for himself the power to set his own wild man free. And this was very much in the work of the mythopoetic men's movement that was flourishing in, I guess, the 80s and the 90s. And it's really, really beautiful work. So the mother's not going to help you. The mother's, she's condemnatory. And it's the boy who has to find the agency to rescue his wild man.
You're really referencing here, both of you, how powerful the feminine is in the psyche of the male, in the form of the mother when young. And going back to Jung's dream, it's the voice of his mother that he hears. And then later on, what Jung says is that the boy has to have the fight with the dragon, the unconscious and the regressive pull back to childhood and back to sort of the protection of the mother. But this huge ambivalence toward the feminine, about which a Jungian author named Erich Neumann wrote in a book called The Fear of the Feminine. Given those givens, and given that a boy must grow and separate from his mother in a way that a girl does not have to, what does that process look like of stealing the key in a real life lived situation and becoming a man and becoming assertive and being proud of Phallos, and the ambivalence around the feminine, of the attraction as puberty strikes to sexuality and for heterosexual men toward women? And what does a healthy embrace of one's own inner wild man, Dionysian energy and sexuality look like?
What I would submit, which is really my own thinking around it, is that the first god that initiates a boy is Pan, which is that purely instinctive springtime rutting feeling that is body-based, that it drives the phallus, the erection, and that sexual tension begins to lead the boy away from the mother towards opportunities to experiment with that and to seek release. That the mother taboo has already been established by the time, a boy is 13 or so. The other thing that most boys will do is they will begin hiding themselves as they sexually mature. They often get very quiet. They kind of hole up in their rooms. They only want to talk to their cohorts. Sometimes they don't even want mom doing their laundry anymore. That there's an enormous secretive circle that needs to constellate, and does in fact constellate, that all parents need to really respect. So Pan wakes up in a boy as a kind of sexual curiosity and enthusiasm, which I think is central. Now, if that's attacked, sexual curiosity is condemned as perversive, and sexual enthusiasm is slapped down either by the young women that he's trying to approach or the family that finds it scornfully funny. So how many times has a young boy tried to make a connection and then the parents get wind of it and then they laugh uproariously in the face of that? And that is a powerful wound to this emergent Pan-like sexuality. So we're really talking at the beginning of the adventure, just as Lisa was saying, some drive to steal the key, to unlock the cage, and to get out into the woods. And we might even say Iron John, which is this mystical creature found at the bottom of a lake covered with bright red hair, is on one dimension. He is Pan. He is a dweller of the woods. It's a somewhat more sophisticated fairy tale because Iron John has other very sophisticated potentialities that continue to evolve as they are needed. But I think the attack on Pan is the first collective wound. And there's a reason that with the rise of Christianity, when it became the Holy Roman Empire, by the way, the devil of Christianity was described in the same terms as the great god Pan, cloven-footed, hairy-legged, horned heads, who was an amalgam of a man and a goat, because goats were considered one of the most robust, sexually fertile creatures in the ancient world. They could survive anywhere, eat anything, and reproduce with great enthusiasm. So when we banish Pan into the unconscious, it doesn't go away. What he starts doing is he's pounding at the floorboards. And then if boys have been shamed or attacked because they're initially carrying the blessings of Pan, then they're driven to their computers and they wind up seeking connection through pornography rather than using that instinctive energy to go and learn how to talk to people they're sexually interested in.
Yes, right, exactly.
And negotiate the very intricate cultural rituals of finding a sexual partner.
So you sort of drive it underground.
So I'm appreciating you're talking about Pan as the first and initiatory god of sexuality, sort of just the biology in that, and the pleasure, the excitement, the joy, the enthusiasm. And how do we distinguish that, especially with all that's going on in our culture now, from just aggression or domination? What happens to the joyfulness of a pubescent boy discovering the magic of his own penis and then moving in a natural way into adulthood and a satisfying sexual life?
I think that's a very complicated, fascinating arc. But the first differentiation that I would offer is Pan is the god of arousal. And arousal can then be canalized into all kinds of different places, both in the body, in the psyche, and the culture. When arousal is met with a welcoming, good-humored attitude, when arousal is met with a strategy to skillfully navigate where the arousal is leading you so that you can have a successful, condoned kind of relationship to it, there isn't actually a lot of primitive aggression and rage because arousal has been welcomed and is being followed. And I would say that this capacity to become impassioned and aroused, whether that's with the literal erection or with the volition inside of a man, is aroused by the idea of getting that job or getting that degree, or he's aroused and steamed up and he's sweaty about buying that house, that phallic, which I've come to call redness, that the redness of the phallus can flow into all kinds of ambition. So if man has an unobstructed relationship to the arousal of Pan, that can be elegantly used as a kind of great furnace for all kinds of very, very positive achievements. And I would suggest the animus, or the masculine dimension of the feminine, in that symbolic way, also has to be aroused in order to support the feminine in that spiritual way. But for men, it's very much in the body. And it has nothing to do with explicit behaviors of bravado or chest pounding. It could. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it doesn't need to be, because we're looking in the aquifer in terms of where is the heat? Where is the redness?
Where's the energy? Yeah, and I think that one of the issues is that there's a way, and I might get skewered for saying this, but there is a way where male sexuality in certain parts of the culture today has been demonized.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think that young men feel that any kind of sexual feeling for a woman or a peer might be transgressive or problematic, that any expression of sexuality could be harmful or get them into trouble, which is literally happening or has been happening on college campuses in the United States.
So we're venturing into this polarity around canalizing sexuality, which you're talking about, Joseph, the furnace and the redness that carries you into life and into relationships. And then the cultural restrictions that you're talking about, Lisa, of don't do this and don't do that, and it has to be a certain way. And I'm just kind of trying to hold both of those of how does it carry a young man forward into his life in a lot of areas, including sex, and how does it restrict his spirit and affect him psychologically? Is this okay? Is this all right? How do I do this?
Well, Joseph, I think what you said a minute ago, vis-a-vis what you're asking, Deb, is really important, that when you drive it underground, you say, it's this really kind of sort of schizophrenic message, that, you're supposed to be a man and get out there in the world and have some aggression and have arousal and desire. But if you don't do it exactly right, then you're going to get in big trouble and you're going to be part of rape culture, or you're going to damage other people. What happens then is you drive this very natural force underground, and it goes into things like pornography. And then you've got young men sitting in their apartments on their computers rather than moving out into the world and being called to take that energy. And like you were saying, Joseph, kind of canalizing it in all different kinds of ways.
Yeah. And that the canalization can become real role restrictions that are very rigid.
It can be if we are living in a very intense environment that demonizes the impassioned energy of men.
Yes, that's a great way of putting it.
And this is something that is so pervasive that young men will police each other around this. I was working with a 16-year-old fellow a number of years ago, and he was talking about how he was navigating these kind of online flirtations. And he used a term which he had to explain to me. And he said, "Oh, that guy's, shows up as thirsty all the time." I was like, what? And I just let it fly. And then he kept using it. I thought, I don't even know what you're talking about. So young men have to walk around pretending that they are disinterested
in sex.
And by extension at that age, towards women or young men or whoever they're sexually attracted to, that pretending that indifference hides the arousal, the enthusiasm, and the curiosity, and that goes underground. And the phonic phallic god that Jung saw in his dream then begins a kind of war drum. And the war is with the man who is oppressing him, and then that war is externalized.
Yeah.
And so men walk around who are intensely sexually frustrated, feeling like they want to punch a hole in a wall. They relieve that through chronic, compulsively driven masturbation, which leaves them under-energized and underappreciating the need to have that fire in themselves.
Right. The redness that you were talking about before. I just want to lift up this phenomenon that I alluded to about what's happening to men on. I don't want to try to solve a cultural debate about sexual assault on campus. Clearly, there are two sides to this, but we are looking at the psychology of men today. And so I do think that this is relevant. I'm paraphrasing from an article that appeared in The Atlantic in 2017. They did a multi-part article on this issue. And they're talking about a young man who was a student at a college, and he, I guess you could say, hooked up with a female student. They were kissing, they smoked weed together. By her own account, she put her hand down his chest and into his pants, and I started giving him a blowjob. And then she wrote that she felt conflicted because she wanted to stop, but she also felt bad about, as she put it, working him up and then backing out. And the Atlantic article goes on to say the encounter continued for a few more minutes, during which he cajoled her to stay, playfully grabbing her arm at one point and drawing her into a kiss, then ended with an exchange of phone numbers. And this young woman had not removed any clothing. So a few days later, she says that she realized that she'd been sexually assaulted. She said that because she didn't want to be there, and I suppose that he was encouraging her to say, she felt violated and he needed to be held accountable. So the campus police got involved, the local police got involved, at the local level, no charges were filed, but the student had all kinds of restrictions on campus that made it very difficult for him to participate in campus life. He couldn't go into certain buildings. He had to eat in this one dining hall. He had to drop out of his activities that he did. And I think we could really ask ourselves, what is the message that we're giving to young people about sex and sexual desire and their responsibility for their experience under these sets of expectations that are so schizophrenic?
It begs the question, Lisa, what kind of archetype is constellating in the collective that can sweep into a young person, a young woman in this case, and reframe her own experience in a way that may be alien to her? Based on the article, I can imagine in the engagement an intensity is constellated that I would call the blessings of Pan. The heat of this kind of sexual arousal carries young people into natural forms of sexual experimentation. I fear that the archetype of Hera, in her destructive form, is re-engineering these kinds of experiences after the fact. Just as she hunted Zeus's lovers, attempting to jealously destroy them for violating her moral code, yet she could rise up and capture a young person's psyche and, like all archetypes, create feelings, body states, and even thoughts that re-script events. And we know this happens because we drop down into that level of memory and experience all the time in an analysis. And we discover there is a tremendous impact of archetypal forces on memory. Something is moving in the collective that can clearly capture and reframe what's a reasonable experimentation and dangerously rename it as pathologic. Young men experience that as an attack upon their essential core, who they are as beings, because that phallic dynamism is central to them. And if that's demonized or thought of as a kind of weapon, you have a generation of your sons, your brothers, walking around feeling that there is something inherently wrong with the center of their being, which then leads to all kinds of symptomology and driving that ancient god under the ground. It absolutely shows up as rage that's expressed in all kinds of environments. Mm-hmm. It shows up as repressed emotions. It shows up as coldness. Mm-hmm. It can show up as a lack of professional interests and even a feeling of embarrassment as a young man tries to pursue what's important to him. It can show up as meanness. It can show up as a kind of castrating niceness, kind of choir boy syndrome. It can show up as an overly constructed life. Like one of the examples of that is chronic overworking. Mm. It can show up as a possession to be overly heroic, as a way to survive that. And it can show up as a kind of timidity, a general sense of shame that he should just keep his mouth shut. Even when he should speak, he should keep his mouth shut, and he should be scanning the environment for what other people need, because his central archetype, which drives and canalizes into many needs, is thought of as perverse and deformed and wrong.
So there's a whole series here of real psychological and emotional violations that can really go to the soul of a young man or an older man. And what is lost here, I'm thinking, as we go back and forth between these polarities, the double bind, the sort of schizophrenic setup that we've talked about, is where is the eros? Women, too, of course, as I think everyone knows, have their side of this discussion. And I know when I was coming of age that, women could be demonized if they dressed too sexually or, quote, let a guy on, unquote. And we could go on and on about that. It's probably a whole other podcast. But I wonder if instead of tilting back and forth between, who's wrong, who's to blame, if we went toward eros and love making, whether it's infused with Dionysian passion or romantic love or any other kinds of feeling, that where's the love in all of this? I deeply and truly desire you, and that the other also is filled with desire. And I wonder if some of these encounters are not infused with that, and that is part of what makes them so confusing. Is how do I read you? Like the article that you cited from The Atlantic. It was not infused with enough passion, enough energy, enough desire.
Yeah, the notion of eros, and I'm thinking, Eros was a god.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Eugene Monick writes in his book Phallos, Sacred Image of the Masculine. He writes that Phallos carries the masculine inner god image for a male. And I'm always very struck by the way that sexuality and sexual experience is a dimension of a kind of religious sensibility at its core. It is religious in nature. And I think that when we divorce ourselves from the divine that we find in our sexuality, then we're left with a nothing but. Sex is nothing but the procreative act, or it's nothing but a perversion, or it's nothing but pleasure. And that's when we're in this territory that is deadening, because the experience doesn't have that resonance of meaning and potential. I mean, I think at bottom, how could it not? But we're cut off from a conscious awareness of that. I have this quote from Jung, not surprisingly, that speaks to this. He says, "Sexuality dished out as sexuality is brutish, but sexuality as an expression of love is hallowed. Therefore, never ask what a man does, but how he does it. If he does it from love or in the spirit of love, he serves a God. And whatever he may do is not ours to judge, for it is ennobled." So, and I think we can understand that quote a couple different ways. I personally choose to believe that when he says it's infused with love, he's not necessarily saying you have to be in a loving relationship with the partner. It could be love of the god Pan. But when we're having sex or we're aroused, that the god is present. And when we shame sex, whether it's through kind of cultural restrictions that flow from kind of dogmatic religious teaching, or we shame it in this new way through kind of cultural restrictions based upon ideas that may be overly rigid, we make it difficult to find the God in the experience.
Yes.
Well, I think the idea that connecting to the transpersonal is central to Jung's discoveries, and the idea that every human experience has an archetypal taproot, and when that taproot can be found, current of energy is opened up between the personal experience and the universal, and that allows it to blossom in a number of ways. What I was disappointed about in that quote is that Jung thinks of sex as brutish and distasteful. It's implied in that. I think that's kind of a compensation because Jung, as a young man, was very libidinous. He had multiple affairs. He was definitely experiencing the blessings of Pan. And whether he's doing this as a public declaration that, all these things have to be sanctified by a higher kind of religious feeling, I question what he was doing with that. It sounds particularly Christian in my thinking, and I think Jung in his private life was really more of a pagan. But I can understand the evolution that while every man, in a sense, needs the blessings of Pan, also when a man falls in love, a second divine archetype is constellated, which I agree with you, Deb, is Eros. And while Eros and sex sometimes blend, I actually think they're two quite different archetypes, because Eros shot arrows into people's hearts, not their genitals, which is very important. That I think Eros drives us to seek connection and companionship, and when that is achieved, it leads to joy. So Eros, we can get shot in the heart and find Eros with our pets. We can find Eros with a mountain. We can find Eros with a career, with the ocean, as well as with a lover, with our children. There's a kind of joy that grows when we are in companionship, a certain kind of companionship. When Eros and Pan are both happy with each other, that can also lead to a very vital, primal sexual dynamism. And I would also venture to say that love is even a different archetype, because I think that love seeks union and wholeness. And that's driven by the god Phallos. And Phallos was an ancient Orphic god who was a being of pure light that broke out of this cosmic egg and was a being of total wholeness who then created all the gods who interacted with each other and created all the permutations of the divine cosmology. But when we're driven to wholeness, we're looking to come back to that archetype of one thing. So love, eros, and sex, while it is an amazing thing when all three are part of a relationship, I think flourish when they're a little bit more differentiated. And I think they have different kinds of divine connections.
I think that's such a really good point to raise. And it takes me to wondering about, in the culture today, especially, let's say, college campuses and young people, of how do young people develop the emotional intelligence to recognize which God may be present? They misread each other in some way. And is there a lost connection with these archetypal forces that you just delineated?
Well, I think this comes to one of the solutions around this wounding of men is mentoring. That there is a way that perhaps older men who have been thoughtful about this can take an interest in other men and enter into these discussions about refined differentiations so that a man can feel the way things are different in his body and in his psyche and in his spirituality, and honor all of them, but to separate them out from a great big, soup where everything's moving around strangely and without a lot of understanding. So I think that is perhaps one of the solutions, which Iron John talks about, extensively, and drove the men's movement in the 80s, which apparently has softened and lost a certain amount of focus. I'd like to just talk very briefly about different categories of male wounding, just for a bit, and we can all kind of chime in. So there's a kind of male to male wounding of Phallos that can lead to a kind of passivity that a wounded man has in the presence of other men. So this can happen when a father is kind of harassing his son, particularly around his dynamism, that the father wants to display a certain capacity of strength and virility, and he does it in a way that also diminishes or humiliates his son. This is also a behavior that's repeated in locker rooms all through junior high school and high school. This idea of harassing the bodies of other men, particularly men that may not be as developed. And in this realm, that Phallos becomes kind of a laughingstock. And in the Roman theater, they talk about Priapus, which was the god of erections, and he would often come on stage and he would have a tremendous 10-foot long artifice strapped to his hips. And he was considered a kind of clown in that theatrical environment. So this can show up as a kind of teasing and humiliation about each other's bodies or even each other's passions. And that can be deeply internalized and needs to be kind of confronted. There's also a kind of female to male wound. We've talked about this as sometimes being the mother wound, that a mother will sometimes monitor her son for his level of masculinity based on her own animus. So if she's raised in a culture where her animus is perhaps even a bit brutish, she will cultivate a brutishness, an aggressiveness in her son The other side of remaining in the Great Mother is when a boy is trained to always be pleasing to the mother. There is some kind of social acculturation that needs to happen, and we don't want to be in constant war with our children. But I've had clients who are in their early 20s, and their mothers are literally screaming at them when they try to date another woman, that the woman is stupid and ugly and inadequate. And she actively interferes with his ability to be aroused about a woman who is not his mother. And that can be almost ubiquitous in the culture and very explicit. So this idea that the mother can feel that the son has to be kept just for her.
Well, and that's an ancient archetypal idea too.
Absolutely. And Jung wrote extensively about it. There's also a kind of self-castration that men can get caught into, which comes from the collective. So a man can internalize certain structures. For instance, in the myth of Addison Cabell, which is something I've talked about before, but in short, Cabell is an ancient earth goddess. She gives birth to her son, who is an impossibly beautiful young man, but he is also her first high priest and her lover. And she does not want him to leave the construct of her divine expectations. Attis falls in love with a girl in the village. The Great Mother is enraged. And to resolve this impossible tension, Attis flees into the forest and cuts his penis off, and his blood showers the forest floor, giving rise to violets. In an attempt to save him, in her horror, Cabell turns him into an evergreen tree. But these impossible conflicts that some men are holding within themselves, that their own internal system will cut off their access to arousal, and they find themselves living a half-life, a provisional life, and particularly staying in the orbit of the mother while they are enraged and resentful and in pain. There can be a very common internalized guilt, so that being sexual just breaks the family law. And this is often experienced as a great betrayal when the young man experiences the fact that his parents are in fact having sex, or the father is having sex outside of the marriage. And while the son has been held to a certain kind of unbreakable purity fantasy, other adults actually have not been complying with that. But really what's happened is that the system has projected that into the son and strangled him into being the example that they themselves cannot live up to. And that can continue to be a reinforcing system within the psyche of the man. The last thing I would say is that there also can be a wounding to the phallic energy just by fate. That fate often deals a terrible blow to a man, and it obliterates his capacity to rally, to want something else, to make yet another choice that's driven by his redness, that his redness can be annihilated by misfortune. And whether that's a terrible wound or a malfunction of his body, or being sacrificed to other cultural gods, which then ruin their connection to their own phallic force. Men are historically sacrificed to war. This has been from the beginning of time, that men are the disposable sex. It's women and children first, and men go down with the ship. They can be possessed by heroic exaltation, in which case that seems very reasonable for them to sacrifice themselves. But many men feel it is their duty to sacrifice themselves to war, sometimes to sacrifice themselves to the family, in as much as they work compulsively and take on the role of the sole provider. Those men, which we think about, the baby boomers and the World War II generation, men were dying a decade earlier than their wives from exhaustion and not being able to treat their bodies in a way that would allow them to sustain. using themselves up and feeling that using themselves up is what's required, that is what it means to be a man. And then the last phallic wound that I would just mention about, and there's much more to say about it, but we're running out of time, is the phallic wound that men experience often in middle age. We're looking at from about 45 on, where their wives decide to shut down the sexual dimension in their relationship for any number of reasons, some of which might be legitimate. But I remember being in a restaurant. I don't think it was a restaurant, it was a party. And there were a number of women in their early 60s who were just enjoying each other and having wine and having a good time. And then one of the other women was really animated and laughing. And she says, as she's pointing to her pelvis, "I just told my husband that this shop is closed." And they all laughed uproariously at this sense of power, I suppose, that she was exercising, that she was done allowing her husband to have access to her body. Is that a woman's privilege? Absolutely. And in our conversation today, what does that do to a man who is expected to continue to support and participate in this marital construct? It's a very complicated thing, but that is deeply wounding to men and can lead to all of these examples of rage that then filters out and marauds around in the culture, creating other problems, other troubles. So much said, much unsaid, much said that maybe could have been said better. But we're all trying to introduce this topic of male wounding in an environment where that particular dimension seems to have fallen silent.
Yeah, it's not something that there's a lot of discussion in the culture around now. And I regret that the mythopoetic men's movement has lost steam, because I think it brought something really, really valuable.
And I agree that much has been unsaid, but I hope that at least we have opened up what seems almost to have been a cultural conspiracy of silence and lifted up some things for consideration and more conversation out there around the wounding of men.
And I would steer the listeners, both male and female, to consider reading Eugene Monick's books on the subject, which are, they're somewhat light treatments of the idea. Monick. He has a book called Phallos. He has a book called Castration and Male Rage, and a book called Aggression, which, when it's properly harnessed, can actually be an initiatic process for men. And for those who are interested, reading those three books will provide, I think, a nice foundation into this consideration.
Those three books and many others that we've touched on today will be in the show notes for your reference.
And let's take a quick pivot and look at a dream. Hey, Lisa, what's been going on about your book?
Well, it was released on May 25th, and sales have been strong, and I've been receiving so many lovely emails and texts and phone calls from friends and from people that I don't know, telling me how much they've enjoyed the book, and so that feels really great. The reviews on Amazon have all been glowing, and that's been really heartening. It's just really wonderful to know that this project of mine is resonating with so many people.
I'm just so happy for you, and it's such a lovely, lovely book, both deep and accessible, about the inner journey around being a mother. That's never been written about. It hasn't been out there. And that it's getting such an enthusiastic, heartfelt reception. That's wonderful.
Yeah, I would love it if listeners who've read the book could write a review on Amazon, because although there are many wonderful ones there, more is always better. So thanks in advance for that.
You've really incarnated something that was in the ethers, but needed to be pulled down, needed to be shaped in words, and needed to be made accessible. And proof in the pudding is that it's beginning to have a kind of life of its own in the collective.
Yes.
That speaks a lot to the timeliness of this.
Yeah, I think you're right, Joseph.
The analogy to a baby is just too rich and too good and too multifaceted to be missed. It's having a life of its own, which is just what we want.
That's right.
And here's the dream. A 46-year-old male who's a researcher writes in, I'm in a taxi on my way to an old friend's wedding on the high street where I live. I had on a great suit which everybody loved, but I had forgotten my tie. I realized I didn't have time to go back home, so I went into the back room of a thrift shop, which only had a selection of boring ties. As I came out, the shop was filled up with wedding guests. Then I found myself in a different, very gloomy, very cluttered thrift shop with no windows or seemingly a door. In it was a blonde woman, who I asked about ties. She pointed to a corner, and I found a couple more boring ties. I picked them up and laid them on a circular, cluttered table to get a better look in the gloom. I then realized on the table was a larger pile of ties, and to my astonishment, they were ones I once had owned, but must have given away to the shop years earlier, still lying there. I told the woman, but she just shrugged. I went through them and found my favorite, which was a dark background with white circles on it. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. For context, he writes, my friend who was getting married actually got married a few years ago. I recently got back in touch with him after the lockdown. We lived together at university. He had commitment issues, so getting married was a big step for him. In Scotland, where I live, it's recently opening up again, so I'm reintroducing myself into social situations. The main feelings in the dream were pride at his suit, but a lot of anxiety about not having a tie. And he offers a bit more explanation. When I was younger, I wasn't as confident in my skin and found formal dress quite stressful to interact with. This is no longer true, and I quite enjoy formal clothes now on my own terms. I have a family in real life, but they seem absent from the dream.
The first question that comes up for me is, what is a tie? Joseph, I think I'm throwing that ball to you because being a man in a man's world where men wear ties, what is the symbolic, social, and any other meaning that our men generally put on ties?
So, not that I am an expert on the history of clothing at all, but a little bit of research yields that neckties started in the mid-1600s, and it spread from Europe, starting in the Croatian mercenaries who wore a kind of knotted handkerchief around their neck. And the Parisians took note of that and began to integrate that as a kind of fashion piece. And I think now, in this modern age, a lot of what ties signify in the Freudian world has something to do with phallic power and phallic novelty.
Mm-hmm. They do have a phallic shape. if they're standard neckties, not bow ties.
I also think that in many corporate cultures where men are expected to be very conservative in their clothing, that little strip of fabric of the tie is one of the rare places where some form of individuality is supported, or novelty.
It's really the adornment of the male clothing. You know, if we're talking about a suit, it's where you get to express something. It's where you get to let your hair down a little bit. It's just in that narrow, 2-inch band or whatever it is.
Some people take an awful lot of creative license with it. We've seen people have really wacky creative ties or little figures on them, which to me is a kind of communication from the unconscious. So sometimes they'll have little strange figures doing strange things on a tie, which is something that you only notice when you get close to somebody. And as they're talking to you, perhaps very formally, you look down and there's like dancing kangaroos on their ties or something, which allows the shadow sometimes to come out in a humorous way also.
Or a little trickster.
Little trickster. But in the dream, and I think for most people, it's the line between business casual and formal wear. That to show up at the wedding without the tie is a declaration of casualness, and to have the tie puts him in accord with the expectations of the wedding that he will be adopting a level of formality. But something in his unconscious is ambivalent about tying himself up in that kind of formality.
Yeah, and he says that he goes into a thrift shop. And not only that, he goes into the back room. So this is going to be kind of probably the lowest tier of tie shopping that there is, as opposed to department stores, where that part of the men's section is often right there on the main floor. That these are the high-priced accessories for male clothing, but our dreamer is in the thrift shop in the back room. And it's gloomy, and it's cluttered, and it doesn't have any windows or seemingly even a door. So he's kind of in a tough spot to get a tie.
You know, I think it's interesting that he said that he felt, really good about wearing. He was in a great suit and he felt really good about it and everyone liked it. So we're clearly in the beginning of the dream in the realm of persona. But something's amiss, and it might be a place where shadow pokes through. And I wonder, this dreamer, I believe, is it 46? Am I recalling that right?
Yeah.
So this might be a little inkling of midlife, that somehow the persona is wearing a little bit thin. Something's not working quite the way it used to. And now it's time to go back.
Yeah.
And recollect something that was discarded a while ago.
Yeah.
And something that used to be his favorite.
Yeah.
That he had somehow given up for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And it's being presided over by the anima.
Yes, a blonde woman. And I think that the tie that he finally finds, which is his very own tie. So he's going back to some earlier foundational sense of self that has apparently been abandoned and given away to the thrift shop. But this tie has a dark background with white circles on it. So the circular theme, as Jung has said over and over again, and it's supported by all kinds of child research and everything else, is, what's a circle? Mandalas are circles. It's the first shape that a child ever draws is a circle. There's a wholeness to it. And maybe he's coming full circle as well, back to connect with parts of himself that were given away or forfeited in some way in order to adapt to the external world.
Yes, so there is an implied conjunctio both in the circle and in the fact that the setting of the dream is a wedding. One that was not easily attained. So there may be a new kind of inner wedding that's being required.
And as a possible little unconscious pun, tying the knot is often a reference for wedding, and you have to tie a knot to put on your necktie.
Yeah.
I like this idea of reclaiming something from the unconscious, something that was discarded, but by remembering the old friend, he's able to go back into some other part of his personality, and that the tie itself is a kind of old friend that he's found in the detritus of the personal unconscious. The thrift store image is interesting because it's a little bit more like Freud's image of the personal unconscious. And Freud imagined that there's just all kind of flotsam and jetsam that just kind of tumbles out from the day and goes into a bit of a thrift store, so to speak, inside of us. Doesn't necessarily have any sense of meaning, but it rumbles around in there. So he's kind of sorting through these piles of discarded images, objects, and memories. But he's driven. I mean, he's not going to go to that wedding without that tie. There's also something, I think, that may have to do with the archetype of the wedding. That at the end, the last sentence is, it wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. And it may have something to do with an evolution in midlife about his own relationship to the archetype of the wedding. That his own marriage, the marriage of his friend, the institution of marriage, isn't perfect, but it's something that's acceptable, that can be tended, that can still be valuable.
I think it's interesting that he called the ties boring twice. And I wonder where that is in his life. If somehow the thing that's calling to him that he needs to go back and reclaim, it's obviously been discounted and devalued by the conscious personality. Whatever those values are that were kind of given up a long time ago, the ego attitude toward them is, oh, they're boring. And yet here they are. You know, they've been discarded. They're in the thrift shop, but they're valuable enough that they're still around.
Mm-hmm. And isn't all that, so that kind of a part of our coming home to ourselves of what seems at first boring turns into there's one that's his favorite, and it's not perfect, but it will do. Of that we come home to ourselves in that way. We stop striving for perfection or for, some sort of incredible persona presentation.
And settle for being ordinary.
Yes, exactly. And that it's okay. It will do. And I can go to the wedding representing a process that's internal, just as I am. And it will be fine.
I'm also wondering if the dream, in a subtle way, has to do with his transition from a year of COVID isolation back into the social sphere. He mentions that in the section about context. So I'm also wondering if getting the right clothing, just as I think you had said, Lisa, about the persona, that as people are re-entering into the collective, they're needing to remember how they negotiated in the social sphere. And there is a dusting off of the persona, which is a kind of social lubricant.
Yeah.
And social norms, for that matter. Some people have been telecommuting to work, wearing pajamas all day.
Apparently clothing sales have been really off during the pandemic.
So resurrecting the forgotten tie is also remembering your professional attitude, your professional presentation. He says that he used to feel very uncomfortable in formal wear and now rather enjoys it. So formality, I think, are the social constructs of a certain strata of society, the codified signals of status. And as we re-enter from COVID isolation out into the world, all of these codified social signals are undoubtedly returning to consciousness, and the dream is, in this rather benign way, is marking his capacity to readapt to being out in the world.
I also think that formal wear in general for men and women is often a mark of kind of self-esteem. People can feel very uncomfortable. Guys can feel very uncomfortable when they have to wear their first suit and tie or a tux. This isn't me. This feels funny and foreign and, I don't know, I feel conspicuous. Versus, Sort of like the old L'Oreal ad, I'm worth it. I can dress up like this and not feel self-conscious. And so I think that it's interesting and heartening at the end when he says that he found formal dress quite stressful before, but now he enjoys formal clothes, that he's comfortable with sort of higher status persona presentation and clothing, that too he can carry.
So it sounds like he's making a solid adaptation into this next stage and recovery of the culture, and is able to step back into his life. Yeah.
And he's comfortable with himself in his, the ordinariness of the tie that he finds. That's his favorite, and comfortable with himself in informal wear. Both of those sides of the same coin. And I think it's really a lovely dream.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.